The 50 continued its cheerful momentum around them, oblivious to the small drama unfolding near the refreshment table. A gramophone somewhere near the bandstand began playing a light Strauss waltz, and several of the younger couples drifted toward the improvised dance floor on the manor's terrace. Children chased each other through the gardens, their laughter piercing the afternoon air with a kind of innocent joy that seemed almost cruel, in contrast to the tension radiating from Margaret Ashworth's rigid posture. She had turned away from Mrs. Fletcher with a murmured excuse, something about needing to check on the trifle table, but her movements were those of a woman operating on pure mechanical instinct rather than conscious thought. Miss Marple, having decided that passive observation had reached its natural limit, set down her teacup on the nearby garden table and made her way toward the refreshment tent with the slow, deliberate pace of an elderly woman for whom haste was both unseemly and uncomfortable. This was, she had learned over many decades, one of the great advantages of her age and position in society. People tended not to notice her movements, and when they did, they attributed no significance to them. She was simply an elderly spinster, perhaps a bit lonely, wandering about the village gathering in search of pleasant company. No one suspected that her seemingly aimless perambulations were guided by a mind as sharp and purposeful as a surgeon's blade. She arrived at the trifle table just as Margaret was arranging and rearranging the desserts with a concentration that seemed entirely divorced from the task at hand. Up close, Miss Marple could see that the mark on Margaret's collarbone was not, as she had initially thought, merely a flush or a trick of the light. It was a bruise, already beginning to deepen into purple, the sort of mark that could only be made by fingers gripping with considerable force. Moreover, Margaret's right hand bore a fresh adhesive plaster on the index finger, and there were small crescents of what appeared to be dried blood beneath the nail of her middle finger. "Mrs. Ashworth, how lovely you look today," Miss Marple said softly, selecting a small portion of trifle with meticulous care. "Though I do wonder if you've been working too hard in your garden. I always say that one becomes so absorbed in one's roses that one forgets to mind the thorns." Margaret's hands stilled for just a moment, and her eyes met Miss Marple's with a flash of something that might have been recognition or fear. "Yes, well," she said quietly, "the roses do require a firm hand sometimes. One must be quite careful with them, or they become unmanageable." There was an odd emphasis on the word firm, and Miss Marple filed this observation away with the same careful precision with which she filed all the other small details that others overlooked. She had learned long ago that people rarely lied outright when cornered. They simply told the truth in carefully selected fragments, hoping that the listener would fail to assemble the pieces correctly. Across the lawn, Daniel Ashworth had excused himself from Lord Pemberton's company and was now engaged in what appeared to be a heated conversation with Mr. James Foster near the croquet lawn. Their voices remained low, but their body language spoke volumes. Daniel's face had flushed a deep crimson, and his jaw was clenched with barely suppressed anger. Foster, for his part, maintained the defensive posture of a man who knows he is guilty of something and is determined not to admit it. When Daniel made a sudden gesture towards Cynthia, who was arranging flowers in a booth some 30 yards away, Foster's expression darkened dangerously. Mrs. Fletcher, meanwhile, had positioned herself near the vicar, the Reverend Theodore Hartley, and was speaking to him with an intensity that suggested she was imparting information of considerable significance. The vicar's normally benevolent expression had grown troubled, and he kept glancing back toward his wife and the refreshment area. He was a good man, Miss Marple thought, the sort of man who carried the burdens of his parish as if they were weights placed upon his shoulders by a merciful God. But good men could be remarkably blind when it came to the failings of those they loved. By 3:30, the tenor of the 50 had subtly shifted. The music continued, and the games proceeded, but there was an undercurrent of something electric running through the gathering. Conversations seemed to hush as people passed one another, and there were more than a few meaningful glances exchanged across the lawn. Gossip, Miss Marple knew, moved through a village with the speed of a contagion, traveling through the smallest channels and infecting every corner of society within hours. Whatever Mrs. Fletcher had discovered or decided to share was already beginning to work its poison through the carefully maintained facade of Thornfield's respectability. As the afternoon light began its slow shift toward evening, taking on that particular golden quality that precedes the longer shadows of late summer, Miss Marple found herself standing alone near the ancient stone wall that bordered the manor grounds. From this vantage point, she could observe the entire gathering, the dancers on the terrace, the game players on the lawn, the clusters of gossiping matrons beneath the oak trees. She was thinking about Margaret's bruised collarbone and the blood beneath her fingernails, about Daniel's ashen face and his angry confrontation with the handsome schoolteacher, about Lord Pemberton's calculating gaze and Cynthia's defiant emerald dress. In her experience, crimes were never simple, and motives were never singular. They accumulated like dust, layer upon layer, until the weight of accumulated grievances and secrets became too great to bear. Someone in this village, she suspected, had finally allowed that weight to tip them over the edge. The question was merely who, and precisely what had driven them to the breaking point. The 50 concluded at precisely 5 o'clock, as it did every year, with the drawing of the raffle prizes and the collective singing of Jerusalem led by Reverend Hartley. Miss Marple participated in the hymn with her usual subdued grace, her thin voice blending seamlessly into the chorus of the village. As the final notes faded across the gardens, she observed Lord Pemberton making his way back into the manor, his expression thoughtful and oddly troubled. He moved with the deliberate slowness of a man carrying some invisible burden, pausing occasionally to acknowledge the departing guests with a wave of his hand. By 6 o'clock, the gardens had emptied of their festive crowds, and the bunting that had seemed so cheerful hours earlier now fluttered above a landscape that felt somehow diminished by absence. Miss Marple accepted a ride home from the vicar, who offered it with the sort of courteous solicitude that suggested his mind was preoccupied with matters far removed from the pleasant conversation they maintained about the parish's improvements and the upcoming autumn harvest festival. He drove her to her cottage on the outskirts of the village, a charming structure covered in climbing roses, and waited until she had safely reached her front door before driving away. She watched his motorcar disappear around the bend in the lane, noting the slump of his shoulders and the way his hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. Whatever had transpired between his wife and Mrs. Fletcher at the FD had clearly reached his ears, and the knowledge was clearly causing him considerable distress. That evening, as Miss Marple settled into her comfortable chair with her knitting, a cardigan in a soft dove gray that matched her temperament precisely, she found her mind returning repeatedly to the small details that had accumulated throughout the afternoon. The bruise on Margaret Ashworth's collarbone suggested violence, but of what nature and perpetrated by whom remained unclear. The blood beneath her fingernails suggested that Margaret might herself have been the agent of violence rather than merely its victim. The tension between Daniel and the schoolteacher, Foster, suggested romantic complications, yet Miss Marple had long since learned that the motives for violence in villages like Thornfield were rarely as straightforward as a simple love triangle. There were always deeper currents, older grievances, accumulated resentments that had nothing to do with the apparent surface drama. She was still contemplating these matters at 9:30 when the telephone rang. It was Mrs. Hudson, who lived in the cottage adjacent to the vicarage, and who had an unfortunate but reliable habit of gathering and disseminating village gossip with the dedication of a professional journalist. Mrs. Hudson's voice was breathless with excitement and barely suppressed horror as she imparted her news. There had been, she said, an altercation of some sort at the manor after the 50 concluded. The servants had heard shouting, Lord Pemberton's voice raised in anger and someone else's voice responding with equal vehemence. The commotion had been sufficiently loud that young Thomas, the undergardener, had actually come in from the grounds to inquire whether assistance was needed. He had been curtly dismissed by Lord Pemberton himself, who had appeared in the doorway looking absolutely furious, his face quite purple with rage. "And that's not all," Mrs. Hudson continued, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial whisper that suggested she was sharing information of the most profound significance. Margaret Ashworth came to the manor this evening. Around 7:30 it was. She went directly to see Lord Pemberton, and she was there for nearly 40 minutes. When she left, her face was absolutely dreadful, Miss Marple. Simply dreadful. Like a woman who had received the most terrible news imaginable. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Hudson for the information, which she dispensed with her usual gracious courtesy, and gently replaced the telephone receiver. She sat in her chair for some moments, her knitting forgotten in her lap, allowing the new information to settle into the framework she had been constructing throughout the afternoon. Margaret visiting Lord Pemberton in the evening was significant, but the timing was perhaps even more significant. Margaret had already been upset at the 50, already bearing those telltale marks of violence. What additional news could possibly have been so distressing that it caused her to visit the manor and spend 40 minutes in the company of a man who appeared to be in the grip of considerable rage? By 10 o'clock that evening, the telephone rang again. This time it was Constable Williams, the village's only policeman, a steady and conscientious man who had held the position for 15 years. His voice was carefully controlled, the sort of careful control that suggested he was attempting to manage a situation that had already begun to escape the boundaries of routine village administration. "Miss Marple was needed," he said, at the manor. There had been an incident. Lord Pemberton was dead, and given the circumstances surrounding his death, the police would need to conduct a thorough investigation. Would Miss Marple be willing to speak with them tomorrow morning? She had been observed at the 50, and she had a reputation, which he spoke of delicately, for noticing things that others might overlook. Miss Marple agreed without hesitation, replaced the telephone receiver, and returned to her knitting. She was not surprised. In fact, had she been honest with herself, she would have admitted that she had been expecting something of precisely this nature since the moment she observed the bruise on Margaret Ashworth's collarbone. What she had not anticipated, however, was precisely who the victim would be, or what the true nature of the underlying conflict might prove to be. She sat in her chair, the cardigan growing slowly beneath her needles, and waited for the morning light that would undoubtedly bring clarity to the situation, along with considerably more complications than anyone in Thornfield had yet begun to imagine. The morning sun filtered through Miss Marple's bedroom curtains with the gentle persistence of an old friend, and she woke at her usual hour of 6 o'clock, as though death and scandal had not disrupted the orderly rhythms of village life. She dressed with her customary care, selecting a dark dress of practical wool. Black would have been excessive, but circumstances seemed to warrant something more somber than her usual pastels, and pinned her hair into its neat, disciplined arrangement. By 7:30, she had consumed a modest breakfast of toast and marmalade, and had settled herself on her front bench with a cup of tea, ostensibly to enjoy the morning air while actually observing the controlled chaos that had begun to unfold in the village. Police motorcars had arrived during the night, and now constables were moving methodically through the grounds of Thornfield Manor, examining the pathways and the gardens with the earnest concentration of men searching for clues. The news had, predictably, spread through the village like wildfire. By 8 o'clock, small clusters of residents had begun to gather at strategic points around the manor, ostensibly about their morning business, but actually conducting an intensive surveillance operation disguised as neighborly concern. Miss Marple recognized Mrs. Hartley, the vicar's wife, speaking in hushed tones with Mrs. Dennison, who ran the village post office. Both women's faces bore the peculiar mixture of genuine shock and barely suppressed fascination that violent death invariably produced in small communities. By 9 o'clock, Inspector Craddock arrived from the county headquarters. A man of perhaps 50 years with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades observing human nature at its worst. He was accompanied by a sergeant, a younger man whose name was Jenkins, and they proceeded directly into the manor with the purposeful efficiency of professionals who knew precisely what they were doing. Within the hour, Miss Marple received a courteous visit from Constable Williams, who asked if she might be available to speak with the inspector at her earliest convenience. She assured him that she was entirely at his disposal and that she had, in fact, anticipated such a request. Inspector Craddock arrived at her cottage at 10 o'clock precisely, and Miss Marple received him in her sitting room, where she had already prepared a modest pot of tea and a plate of biscuits. The inspector seemed initially inclined to dismiss her as simply another elderly village resident, a courtesy call that could be dispensed with quickly. However, as she began to recount the events of the previous afternoon with meticulous precision, his manner changed subtly. He began to listen with genuine attention, his eyes growing sharper as she described the bruise on Margaret Ashworth's collarbone, the blood beneath her fingernails, the heated confrontation between Daniel and James Foster, and most significantly, Margaret's evening visit to the manor. "You observed all of this during a village fete?" he asked, his tone suggesting a mixture of skepticism and reluctant respect. "One observes what one pays attention to," Inspector Miss Marple replied gently. Most people at a fete are focused on the immediate enjoyment of the event. They do not notice the small details of human behavior that reveal the underlying tensions. I have found, however, that small villages are remarkably similar to small drawing rooms. The dynamics are essentially the same, merely operating on a slightly larger scale. The inspector leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that suggested he was reassessing his initial judgments. He then proceeded to inform her, with professional discretion, of the nature of Lord Pemberton's death. He had been found in his study at approximately 9:15 the previous evening by his valet, who had come to inquire whether his employer required anything before retiring for the night. Lord Pemberton had been sitting in his leather armchair, and there was no visible sign of violence. The preliminary examination suggested poisoning, though the specific substance would need to be confirmed by the toxicologist. There was, however, evidence that something had been added to his evening brandy, as residue from a glass found near his body suggested the presence of a substance that did not belong there. "The curious thing," Inspector Craddock continued, "is that Lord Pemberton was not universally beloved. In fact, preliminary interviews suggest that several people had reason to wish him harm. His valet reports that he received multiple visitors yesterday evening, including Mrs. Margaret Ashworth, who arrived unannounced at approximately 7:30 and remained for some 40 minutes. There was also evidence of a prior quarrel, furniture overturned in the study, a lamp broken, and the general appearance of a confrontation that had become physical." Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. "I assume you have already spoken with Mrs. Ashworth?" "We have," the inspector confirmed. "She admits to visiting the manor yesterday evening, but she claims it was a routine social call to discuss a parish matter. However, her story does not entirely account for the physical evidence, the broken lamp, the overturned furniture, and her own injuries, which she attempts to attribute to an accident in her garden. Moreover, her husband claims that she did not return home until nearly 9 o'clock, which is considerably later than a simple social call would require." The inspector paused, watching Miss Marple's face with the intensity of a man attempting to read a particularly subtle text. "What is your assessment, Miss Marple? You seem to have observed more than most during that 50, and you appear to understand the dynamics of this village rather well." Miss Marple was silent for a long moment, her fingers folded neatly in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was carefully measured, as though she was selecting each word with meticulous care. "I believe, Inspector, that the situation at Thornfield Manor is considerably more complex than a simple crime of passion. There are multiple motives, multiple opportunities, and multiple individuals who appear to have reason to wish Lord Pemberton dead. However, I would be cautious about accepting the most obvious explanation. In my experience, the most readily apparent suspect is often not the guilty party. There are usually deeper currents running beneath the surface, and one must be prepared to look beneath the obvious to discover the truth." Inspector Craddock departed Miss Marple's cottage at 11 o'clock, leaving behind him a sense of cautious respect that had not been present upon his arrival. He had, she suspected, begun to recognize that her observations were not merely the scattered impressions of a gossipy elderly woman, but rather the carefully noted details of someone whose lifetime of observation had made her remarkably skilled at understanding human motivation. As she watched his motorcar disappear down the lane, Miss Marple found her mind returning to the precise architecture of the crime. Someone had poisoned Lord Pemberton, and that someone had either done so before Margaret's visit or had somehow ensured that Margaret would be blamed for an act she may not have committed. Both scenarios were equally interesting, though for different reasons. By noon, the village had begun to organize itself into factions, as villages always did in the aftermath of scandal. The primary theory, which seemed to dominate the conversations Miss Marple overheard as she made her way to the village shops, centered on Margaret Ashworth. She had visited the manor, she had injuries suggesting she had been in a struggle, and she had motive. Though what that motive was remained the subject of considerable speculation. Some suggested that Lord Pemberton had been conducting an inappropriate relationship with Cynthia, and that Margaret, as a protective mother figure, had confronted him. Others whispered about money, suggesting that Lord Pemberton had threatened to expose some financial indiscretion on the part of Daniel Ashworth. Still, others spoke in hushed tones about more scandalous matters entirely, though most prudently avoided specifics in public conversation. At the village post office, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Dennison, who was dispensing information with almost evangelical fervor. Margaret had been taken in for questioning, she reported with evident satisfaction, and she had not yet been released. Daniel Ashworth had hired a solicitor from the county town, which was taken by most as a sign of guilt, though Miss Marple recognized it as merely a sign of prudent legal caution. More significantly, Mrs. Dennison had received a package delivery that morning, a letter from Lord Pemberton's solicitors in London, addressed to the manor. The solicitors, when contacted by the police, had indicated that the letter contained matters of considerable legal importance, though they would not elaborate on the specifics. And another thing, Mrs. Dennison continued, leaning across the counter in a conspiratorial manner. "I've heard, though this is strictly confidential, you understand, that there's been some irregularity in the village accounts. Lord Pemberton was the treasurer for the parish charities, and there may have been some questions about how the money was being handled. If Daniel Ashworth was involved in something improper, well, that would certainly give him reason to wish Lord Pemberton dead, wouldn't it?" Miss Marple made a non-committal sound that suggested she was considering this information with appropriate seriousness, while actually noting that Mrs. Dennison had clearly been speaking with someone who had access to information the police would not yet have made public. That someone, she suspected, was likely Constable Williams, who had always been susceptible to the charms of a woman who expressed genuine interest in his work. She purchased her usual items, tea, biscuits, and a small packet of wool for her knitting, and made her way back toward her cottage, her mind working through the possibilities like a skilled needleworker working through a particularly intricate pattern. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Reverend Hartley appeared at her cottage door, his appearance suggesting that he had not slept the previous night. His eyes were hollow, and his hands trembled slightly as she invited him inside and pressed a cup of tea into his fingers. He sat in her sitting room with the posture of a man who had been carrying a burden far too heavy for his shoulders, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Miss Marple," he began, "I find myself in a position of considerable moral confusion. As a clergyman, I am bound by the sanctity of confession and the confidentiality of pastoral communications. Yet I am also aware that a terrible crime has been committed, and that an innocent person may be falsely accused of that crime. I am uncertain how to proceed." Miss Marple set down her own teacup with deliberate care. "Tell me, Reverend, what is troubling your conscience?" The vicar took a long breath, and when he spoke, his words came in a rush, as though he had been holding them back with great effort and could now no longer maintain the strain. "Margaret came to see me yesterday evening, after she had visited the manor. She was deeply distressed, though she would not initially tell me why. When I pressed her, she revealed that she had gone to Lord Pemberton to confront him about certain matters of a delicate nature. What she told me at that moment has placed me in an agonizing position, for I believe it bears directly on this investigation. Yet it also involves information that was given to me in confidence by another person entirely." "Who?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "Cynthia," the vicar said heavily. "Cynthia came to me 3 weeks ago, and she confessed that she had become involved in an inappropriate relationship with Lord Pemberton. She was deeply ashamed and sought my guidance. I counseled her to break off the relationship immediately and to seek forgiveness. I also suggested that if the relationship had progressed to any degree of physical intimacy, she should inform her parents. I believe that Margaret learned of this situation, I do not know how, and confronted Lord Pemberton about it. What happened during that confrontation, I cannot say. But I know that Margaret did not leave that manor with murder in her heart." Miss Marple processed this information with her usual careful attention. "And did Margaret tell you what Lord Pemberton's response was to her confrontation?" "He denied everything," the vicar said. "He claimed that Cynthia had misinterpreted his attentions, that he had been nothing but kind to a young woman who reminded him of his deceased daughter. He said that Margaret was being manipulated by a foolish girl who had developed an inappropriate infatuation. He made it clear that he had no intention of ceasing his friendship with Cynthia, and he suggested that if Margaret continued to interfere, there would be consequences for Daniel's position in the village." Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her fingers steepled thoughtfully beneath her chin. What she was hearing suggested not one motive for murder, but several, layered upon one another like the intricate patterns in a piece of fine needlework. And it suggested as well that Margaret Ashworth, whatever her injuries and whatever her visit to the manor, might indeed be precisely what she claimed to be. Not a murderer, but a victim of circumstance, caught in the web of secrets and resentments that had finally reached the breaking point. After the vicar departed, leaving behind him a palpable sense of relief at having shared his burden, Miss Marple sat alone in her sitting room and allowed herself the luxury of prolonged contemplation. The late afternoon light was beginning to take on that particular quality of gold that preceded evening, and the shadows in her garden were growing longer. She had lived long enough to understand that human behavior was rarely simple, that motives accumulated and intertwined like the roots of ancient trees, and that the most obvious narrative was frequently a carefully constructed facade designed to conceal deeper truths. What she needed now was not more information about the events of the previous evening, but rather a clearer understanding of the relationships and resentments that had been building in Thornfield for months, perhaps years, before Lord Pemberton's death. She began by considering Cynthia Ashworth, a young woman of considerable beauty, but, it appeared, limited judgment. That she had allowed herself to become involved with a man 40 years her senior suggested either a desperate need for attention or a calculated seduction designed to achieve some specific purpose. Miss Marple knew from her observations at the Fifth that Cynthia had been interacting with James Foster, the schoolteacher, with considerable intimacy. What, then, was her relationship with Lord Pemberton? Was she simultaneously involved with both men, or had the involvement with Foster begun after, or perhaps as a result of, some crisis involving Lord Pemberton? These were questions that required answers, and answers that could only be obtained through careful and subtle investigation. By 4:30, Miss Marple had made a decision. She dressed in her outdoor coat and hat and made her way to the village school, arriving at precisely the moment when the day's lessons were concluding and the children were being released into the care of their parents or guardians. She positioned herself near the gate with the appearance of someone simply enjoying the pleasant afternoon, and within minutes, James Foster emerged from the school building, carrying a stack of exercise books and appearing thoroughly absorbed in his own thoughts. He was, she noted, a handsome man in the manner that appealed to younger women, dark-haired, with intelligent eyes and a certain intensity of manner that suggested depths of feeling beneath a calm exterior. "Mr. Foster," Miss Marple called out gently, "I wonder if I might have a word with you." "I am Miss Marple, and I have known your mother these 30 years or more. We were at school together, in fact." Foster's expression shifted from mild irritation at the interruption to something more attentive. "Miss Marple, yes, of course. My mother has spoken of you many times. Is there something I can assist you with?" "I merely thought we might walk together for a moment," Miss Marple suggested. "There are matters relating to the unfortunate situation at the manor that I believe you may be able to illuminate." They walked slowly along the lane leading away from the school, and Miss Marple began by discussing the weather, the quality of the school's academic program, and the general pleasantness of the village. Only when they had reached a point sufficiently remote from other pedestrians did she permit the conversation to shift toward more significant matters. "I understand that you had a disagreement with Mr. Daniel Ashworth yesterday afternoon," she said quietly. "At the 50, I believe. Near the croquet lawn." Foster's jaw tightened, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might refuse to answer. However, after a brief pause, he said, "Mr. Ashworth was concerned about his daughter's welfare. He had reason to believe that certain attentions were being paid to her by someone who should have known better. He expressed his displeasure at this situation in terms that were somewhat forceful." "And what did you say to Mr. Ashworth?" Miss Marple asked. "I told him that his daughter is a woman of considerable maturity and judgment, capable of making her own decisions about the company she keeps. I also suggested that if he was concerned about her, he might exercise more attention to her well-being and less concern for maintaining the social pretense that everything in his household was precisely as it should be." They had reached a point where the lane curved around a small copse of trees, and Miss Marple paused to examine a particularly interesting wildflower growing near the pathway. "And did Mr. Ashworth respond to this advice?" "He accused me of seducing his daughter, and suggested that I was attempting to use her as a means to gain access to the family's financial resources. He also mentioned that if he discovered that I had had any inappropriate contact with Cynthia, he would ensure that I was removed from my position at the school and that my reputation would be destroyed." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Mr. Ashworth appears to have been a man of considerable anxiety yesterday afternoon. I wonder what prompted such deep concern about his daughter's associations. One might almost imagine that he had received some disturbing information recently." Foster was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of genuine anguish. "Cynthia told me 3 days ago that she had been receiving unwanted attention from Lord Pemberton. She said that his behavior had progressed from friendly concern to something considerably more inappropriate. She was deeply distressed about the situation, and she did not know how to extricate herself without causing a scandal that would reflect poorly on her family. I suggested that she speak with her mother, but she was afraid of Margaret's reaction. She seemed to believe that Margaret would blame her, that she would consider Cynthia's youth and beauty to be somehow culpable in the matter." "And how did you respond to this revelation?" Miss Marple asked. I urged her to tell her parents immediately and to cease all contact with Lord Pemberton. I offered to speak with her father myself if she wished, though she was adamantly opposed to that course of action. I believe that what happened next was that someone, either Cynthia or Daniel himself, informed Margaret of the situation. And Margaret, being the protective woman that she is, decided to confront Lord Pemberton herself. They had begun walking back toward the village, and Miss Marple reflected on what Foster had told her. The narrative was becoming clearer, though it still contained significant gaps. The question that remained was this: if Margaret had confronted Lord Pemberton and had somehow become physically involved in an altercation with him, had she been present when he died? Or had she left the manor alive and someone else had administered the poison? And if someone else had poisoned him, who had that person been, and what had motivated them to commit the act? Miss Marple returned to her cottage as the evening shadows were lengthening across the gardens, and she found herself in a state of contemplative uncertainty that was itself unusual. She had spent 7 decades refining her ability to understand human motivation, and yet the events unfolding in Thornfield seemed to resist the neat categorization that usually came so easily to her. What she possessed was not facts, but rather a collection of behaviors, statements, and observations that suggested multiple possible narratives, each of which contained elements of truth, but none of which seemed entirely satisfactory. She settled herself in her sitting room with her knitting, and as her needles worked their familiar rhythm, she found her mind organizing the information she had gathered like a chess player, considering the positions of pieces on a board. Margaret Ashworth had visited Lord Pemberton and had engaged with him in some sort of physical altercation. That much seemed certain. The bruises on her body and the blood beneath her fingernails suggested that she had either defended herself against his advances or had attacked him in a fit of righteous anger. However, the question of whether she had poisoned him remained unanswered, and Foster's account suggested that her primary motivation had been protective rather than vengeful. A woman defending her daughter against inappropriate advances might well resort to violence. But would she resort to poison? Poison suggested premeditation, calculation, a coldness of purpose that seemed at odds with the defensive nature of a mother protecting her child. Then there was Daniel Ashworth, whose anxiety and anger on the day of the 5th now took on new dimensions of meaning. If he had learned of Lord Pemberton's behavior toward his daughter, his rage would have been understandable. Moreover, the vicar's comments about parish finances suggested that there might be additional complications, additional reasons why Lord Pemberton's death might have served Daniel's interests. A man in Daniel's position, a solicitor, a professional whose reputation was his primary asset, would have had considerable motivation to ensure that any scandal involving impropriety was contained. But would he have poisoned Lord Pemberton in broad daylight, with multiple people visiting the manor, and with the knowledge that his wife was about to arrive for a confrontation? The third possibility, and the one that Miss Marple found herself increasingly contemplating, involved Mrs. Constance Fletcher. That formidable woman had been present at the 50, had engaged in some sort of significant conversation with Margaret, and had subsequently spoken with the vicar. She was the eldest resident of the village, the keeper of its secrets, and the arbiter of its social standards. She had also, if Miss Marple's memory served her correctly, been widowed twice, and had outlived most of her contemporaries through a combination of good health and excellent judgment. What role had Mrs. Fletcher played in the events leading to Lord Pemberton's death? And what had she discovered or decided to do that had prompted her to speak with both Margaret and Reverend Hartley? At 7 o'clock the telephone rang, and it was Inspector Craddock. He requested, with the courtesy of a man who understood the value of treating potential witnesses with respect, whether Miss Marple might receive him for a second consultation. She agreed immediately, and within the hour he was sitting in her cottage, his expression suggesting that the investigation had taken a turn that was proving more complicated than he had initially anticipated. "We have released Mrs. Ashworth," he said without preamble. The evidence against her, while suggestive, was not sufficiently conclusive to warrant her continued detention. However, the case has taken an unexpected direction. The toxicologist has identified the poison as a derivative of digitalis, which is commonly found in foxglove plants. The curious thing is that foxglove is grown in several gardens in this village, but there is also a significant quantity of it in the manor's own gardens. Moreover, examination of Lord Pemberton's study has revealed that the brandy glass from which he drank contained not only the poison but also traces of a particular brand of tea, which suggests that whoever administered the poison may have done so earlier in the day, or that the poison was mixed with something else before being added to the brandy. Miss Marple listened carefully to this information, and a particular possibility began to crystallize in her mind. "Inspector, who has access to the manor's gardens? The grounds are open during daylight hours, and the servants move freely among them. However, there is a locked gate on the north side that provides access to the more formal gardens near the house itself. Only Lord Pemberton, his valet, and the head gardener possess keys to that gate. And has anyone examined whether any of the foxglove plants have been recently disturbed or harvested?" Craddock's expression suggested that this line of inquiry had not yet occurred to his investigators. "I shall have that examined immediately," he said. "However, I confess that I am puzzled by your particular interest in the foxglove. Are you suggesting that Lord Pemberton's killer may have prepared the poison some time in advance?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said carefully, "that one must consider not only when the poison was administered, but also who might have had opportunity and reason to prepare it. A person who collects foxglove and prepares a poison from it is someone with knowledge of plants and considerable determination. Such a person would not act on impulse, but rather on a settled conviction that murder was necessary. That suggests someone who had been contemplating this act for some time, perhaps waiting for the right opportunity to present itself." After the inspector had departed, Miss Marple found herself returning to a question that had been troubling her since her conversation with the vicar. She had assumed that Cynthia had revealed Lord Pemberton's inappropriate behavior to Foster, and that Foster had then presumably informed Daniel. But what if the information had come from a different source? What if someone had observed the behavior and had reported it directly to Mrs. Fletcher, who then had decided to take action? Mrs. Fletcher, with her decades of experience in managing village affairs, with her knowledge of Lord Pemberton's character and his weaknesses, with her access to the manor as an established family friend. Mrs. Fletcher would have had both the opportunity and perhaps the resolve to do what she believed necessary to protect the village's young people from predation. The morning of the third day following Lord Pemberton's death dawned grey and overcast, as though the weather itself had decided to reflect the gloom that had settled over Thornfield. Miss Marple rose at her customary hour and dressed in her dark wool dress, sensing that the day ahead would require both dignity and the subtle authority that came from dressing appropriately for significant occasions. She had spent the previous evening in consideration of the foxglove question, and by the time she retired for the night, a particular suspicion had begun to solidify in her mind. It was a suspicion that required confirmation, and confirmation required a conversation with someone who had thus far not been directly interrogated by the police, primarily because she was 73 years old and had seemed incapable of the physical violence that the initial investigation had suggested was necessary. Miss Marple made her way to Mrs. Constance Fletcher's residence at 9:30, arriving unannounced but not entirely unexpected. Mrs. Fletcher, she knew from decades of observation, was a woman who appreciated directness in her interactions, particularly with those who understood the complexities of village life as thoroughly as she did. She was received in Mrs. Fletcher's sitting room, a space that reflected its occupant's taste and personality with remarkable precision. The furniture was excellent but not ostentatious, the artwork selected with genuine appreciation rather than concern for display, and every surface bore evidence of a life lived with intelligence and purpose. Mrs. Fletcher was 79 years old, a woman whose hair had turned entirely silver and whose eyes retained the sharpness of someone whose mind remained undiminished by age. She looked at Miss Marple with an expression that suggested she had been expecting this visit, that she understood precisely why Miss Marple had come, and that she was prepared to acknowledge the truth if it was presented to her with sufficient delicacy and respect. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Fletcher said without preamble, "I assume you have come to discuss the matter of Lord Pemberton's death. I should be grateful if you would sit, and I shall offer you some tea. I suspect we have a good deal to discuss." They sat in companionable silence while Mrs. Fletcher prepared the tea with practiced efficiency, and Miss Marple observed her hostess with the careful attention of a woman reading a particularly complex text. Mrs. Fletcher's hands, she noted, were steady and showed no sign of the tremor that might be expected in a woman of her age. Her face bore the composed expression of someone who had made a difficult decision and had accepted the consequences of that decision with equanimity. When the tea had been served, Mrs. Fletcher settled herself in her chair and began to speak. "I became aware of Lord Pemberton's behavior toward Cynthia Ashworth approximately 6 weeks ago. I observed them together in the village shop, and the manner in which he was speaking to her, the proximity he maintained, the particular quality of his attention. All of these things suggested to me that his interest in the girl was not what it purported to be. I am an old woman, Miss Marple, and I have seen many forms of human wickedness in my lifetime. I recognized this form immediately." Miss Marple sipped her tea and waited. Mrs. Fletcher continued. "I made discreet inquiries, as is my custom. I spoke with some of the servants at the manor, and I learned that Lord Pemberton had taken to inviting Cynthia to the manor for social calls when no other guests were present. He had been increasingly intimate in his manner toward her, making comments about her beauty that had begun to take on an inappropriate quality. Most distressingly, I learned that on one occasion he had attempted to kiss her, and only her quick removal from the situation had prevented the matter from progressing further. Cynthia had confided in young Foster, and Foster had urged her to speak with her parents, but she was afraid to do so, fearing that she would be blamed for somehow encouraging his behavior." "And what did you do?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "I confronted Lord Pemberton myself. 3 weeks ago, I called upon him at the manor and made it clear that his behavior was unacceptable and that I expected it to cease immediately. I informed him that if he continued to pursue Cynthia, I would ensure that the entire village understood the nature of his character. I believed that this warning would be sufficient to deter him. I was, as it transpired, naive in my assessment of his character and his capacity for reform." Mrs. Fletcher paused to take a long drink of her tea. 2 weeks later, I learned from a servant that Lord Pemberton had resumed his attention towards Cynthia, that he had even begun suggesting to her that he could be instrumental in arranging an advantageous marriage for her, a statement that revealed the depth of his delusion regarding his own appeal and his capacity to manipulate a young woman into accepting his advances. It was at that moment that I made the decision that something more definitive would be required. "Tell me," Miss Marple said, "about the foxglove." "I have kept a garden for 60 years, Mrs. Fletcher replied, "and I have considerable knowledge of plants and their properties. I am also aware that foxglove, when properly prepared, contains compounds that can be extremely dangerous in concentrated doses. I began to consider whether it might not be possible to prepare such a substance, and whether the administration of such a substance might not be justified as a matter of protecting young women in the village from a predatory man who had demonstrated both the inclination and the opportunity to cause them harm." "And did you act on this consideration?" Miss Marple asked. "I did," Mrs. Fletcher said calmly. I prepared a concentrated extract from foxglove plants, taking considerable care to ensure that the process was completed safely. I then added this extract to a bottle of Lord Pemberton's favorite brandy, which I knew he kept in his study and which he habitually drank in the evening. I performed this action on the afternoon of the fete, while the household was in relative disarray due to the servants' attendance at the festivities. I did so with the full understanding that I was committing an act that was both morally justified and legally indefensible. I did so because I believed, and I continue to believe, that in this instance the protection of the vulnerable was a higher moral imperative than adherence to legal convention. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care, and for a long moment neither woman spoke. The afternoon light filtered through Mrs. Fletcher's windows, casting soft shadows across the room, and the ticking of the mantelpiece clock seemed unusually loud in the silence that had fallen between them. Miss Marple was aware that she had arrived at one of those critical junctures that appeared only occasionally in the course of an investigation. A moment where the truth had been acknowledged, and the question of what to do with that truth demanded resolution. "Why did you tell me?" Miss Marple asked finally. "You could have maintained your silence. The police have released Mrs. Ashworth, and their investigation seems to be progressing along lines that do not directly implicate you. You might have taken this secret to your grave with impunity." Mrs. Fletcher's expression softened slightly, and for the first time, Miss Marple detected something akin to vulnerability in the elderly woman's carefully composed features. "Because you are not merely anyone, Miss Marple. You are a woman who understands that human motivation is rarely simple, that the boundaries between right and wrong are sometimes far less clearly demarcated than society would have us believe. You came here this morning not with accusations but with understanding. I recognized that quality in you, and I believed that you deserved the truth. Moreover, I have lived my entire life in service to this village, in maintenance of its social fabric and protection of its most vulnerable members. I could not bear the thought that an innocent woman might be condemned for an act that she did not commit, particularly when I was the one responsible for that act." "And Margaret Ashworth's visit to the manor?" Miss Marple asked. "What role did that play in the events of that evening?" "Margaret came to confront Lord Pemberton about his behavior toward her stepdaughter," Mrs. Fletcher explained. "She arrived at approximately 7:30, and she and Lord Pemberton engaged in a heated altercation. I know this not from direct observation, but from the servants' subsequent accounts. What occurred between them during that confrontation is that Margaret, in the heat of her anger, struck Lord Pemberton across the face, and then, when he attempted to restrain her, they became physically entangled. This is how Margaret sustained her injuries and how blood came to be beneath her fingernails. However, the poison that killed him had been in his brandy since mid-afternoon. He did not die because of Margaret's visit. He would have died whether she came to the manor or not." Miss Marple absorbed this information and found herself contemplating the particular cruelty of circumstance. Margaret's presence at the manor, her physical altercation with him, her visible injuries, all of these things made her appear to be a prime suspect in his death. You must have realized that she would become the focus of the investigation. "I did," Mrs. Fletcher acknowledged. "And I understood that she would suffer for it, that she would endure suspicion and interrogation and public speculation about her character and her motives. I believed, I continue to believe, that her suffering would be temporary, that once the investigation progressed, the lack of concrete evidence would eventually lead to her exoneration. What I did not anticipate was the depth of the police's desire to close the case quickly, the way in which circumstantial evidence and proximity can create a narrative that is nearly as damaging as actual guilt. What you are describing," Miss Marple said quietly, "is a willingness to sacrifice one innocent person to save another. You were prepared to allow Margaret Ashworth to be charged with murder, knowing full well that she was innocent. because you believed that the truth would eventually emerge. I would not have allowed her to be convicted, Mrs. Fletcher said firmly. Had it become apparent that the police were moving toward charges against her, I would have come forward. But I believed that in a just investigation, the truth would reveal itself. I believed that you, specifically, would be capable of seeing through the obvious narrative to the deeper reality. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the window, where she could observe the village beyond Mrs. Fletcher's garden. The streets were quiet, as they always were on a grey afternoon in the English countryside, and the residents who passed by remained entirely unaware of the conversation taking place within this sitting room. "What you have done," she said, "is commit an act of violence in the name of justice. You have appointed yourself judge, jury, and executioner based on your assessment of Lord Pemberton's character and his potential future actions. You did not witness him attempting anything beyond the boundaries of propriety with Cynthia. You witnessed him behaving inappropriately, and you extrapolated from that behavior to conclusions about his intentions. Are you suggesting," Mrs. Fletcher asked, "that I was wrong to act?" Miss Marple turned from the window and met Mrs. Fletcher's gaze directly. "I am suggesting that the question of right and wrong in this matter is considerably more complex than either of us might wish it to be. Lord Pemberton was indeed behaving reprehensibly towards Cynthia. There is no question about that. Whether his behavior would have escalated to outright criminal assault is something that neither of us can know with certainty. What is certain is that he is now dead, and that Cynthia Ashworth and her family have been spared whatever consequences might have resulted from his continued predatory behavior. What is also certain is that you have now placed me in an extraordinarily difficult position, for I cannot, in good conscience, withhold knowledge of a murder from the authorities. Yet I also recognize that what you did was motivated by a desire to protect the vulnerable." Mrs. Fletcher rose from her chair with considerable dignity. "I am aware of the position in which I have placed you, Miss Marple, and I accept full responsibility for that action. I am prepared to confess to the police. I am prepared to face whatever consequences flow from that confession. All I ask is that you allow me to inform Inspector Craddock of my actions directly, rather than forcing him to learn of them from you. I believe that much, at least, I deserve." Miss Marple returned to her cottage at 3 o'clock that afternoon and spent the next 2 hours in contemplation of the extraordinary moral dilemma that now confronted her. She sat in her sitting room with her knitting, though her needles remained largely idle, and she allowed her mind to wander through the labyrinthine complexities of the situation with the precision of a trained logician examining the validity of a philosophical argument. The fundamental question that troubled her was not whether Mrs. Fletcher had committed murder, that fact had been clearly established, but rather what obligation she herself possessed to report that murder to the authorities, given the particular circumstances and motivations involved. In her 73 years, Miss Marple had encountered many instances where the law and morality had diverged, where legal obligation and human compassion pointed in opposing directions. She had learned long ago that the world operated according to principles far more nuanced than the simple dichotomy of right and wrong that was taught in churches and schoolrooms. Yet she had also come to understand that the maintenance of civilized society depended upon the assumption that certain foundational principles, among them the principle that murder was wrong, were inviolable, that they could not be suspended even when motivated by the most sympathetic of intentions. At 4 o'clock, the telephone rang. It was Inspector Craddock, and his voice suggested that recent developments had caused him considerable frustration. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "we have encountered something of an impasse in the investigation. The examination of the foxglove plants at the manor has confirmed that several specimens appear to have been recently harvested and processed. However, the person responsible for that harvesting is not immediately apparent. The head gardener denies any knowledge of the matter, and the servants similarly claim ignorance. We have also discovered that multiple individuals in this village had access to the manor's gardens at various times. I wonder if you might be willing to meet with me this evening. I find myself in need of your particular perspective on this matter." Miss Marple informed the inspector that she would be delighted to receive him at 7 o'clock, and she then spent the remainder of the afternoon in preparation for a conversation that she suspected would prove to be one of the most difficult of her life. She prepared a fresh pot of tea, arranged biscuits on a plate, and composed her thoughts regarding the proper manner in which to present the truth to a man bound by professional obligation to enforce the law, regardless of the moral complexities that might surround a particular case. Inspector Craddock arrived punctually at 7, and Miss Marple observed that he bore the appearance of a man laboring under considerable stress. The investigation, she suspected, had begun to fragment in precisely the manner that police investigations often did when multiple suspects possessed apparent motive and opportunity, but none possessed conclusive physical evidence. The inspector settled himself in her sitting room with evident relief, accepted a cup of tea with gratitude, and waited for Miss Marple to speak. "Inspector," Miss Marple began carefully, "I must inform you that in the course of my private observations, I have come into possession of information that bears directly upon the identity of Lord Pemberton's murderer. This information was not obtained through any illegal means, nor was it obtained in confidence that I would maintain silence regarding it. However, the circumstances surrounding the revelation of this information are such that I felt obligated to present the matter to you with the utmost delicacy and respect for all parties involved." The inspector leaned forward, his attention now entirely focused on Miss Marple's words. "Please, continue." "The person responsible for Lord Pemberton's death," Miss Marple said, "is Mrs. Constance Fletcher. She administered the poison, a derivative of foxglove prepared through her own knowledge of plant chemistry, to his brandy on the afternoon of the fête. She did so because she had become aware that Lord Pemberton was engaging in predatory behavior towards Cynthia Ashworth, and she determined that the threat he posed to the young women of the village was sufficiently serious to warrant his elimination. She acted not from personal malice, but from a conviction that she was performing a necessary public service, protecting the vulnerable from exploitation by a man who had demonstrated both inclination and opportunity to cause them harm. The inspector's expression shifted through several distinct stages, first surprise, then skepticism, then a dawning comprehension that Miss Marple would not present such information unless she possessed absolute certainty regarding its accuracy. "You are telling me," he said slowly, "that one of the most respected and longest established residents of this village deliberately murdered another resident in order to protect a third resident from potential future harm." "I am telling you precisely that," Miss Marple confirmed. "Moreover, I am telling you that Mrs. Fletcher is prepared to confess to this act, to provide you with full details regarding her method and her motivations, and to face whatever legal consequences flow from her actions. She has asked only that she be permitted to make this confession directly to you, rather than having it revealed through intermediaries." The inspector sat back in his chair, and Miss Marple could observe the various considerations working through his mind with visible effort. He was a conscientious man, bound by duty to enforce the law, yet he was also a man capable of recognizing the moral complexities that sometimes surrounded criminal behavior. "Miss Marple," he said finally, "I must ask you a direct question, and I expect a direct answer. Are you attempting to manipulate me into some course of action based on your own moral assessment of this situation, or are you presenting me with factual information regarding a crime that has been committed?" "I am presenting you with factual information," Miss Marple said. "I have no desire to manipulate you, nor would I attempt to do so. What you choose to do with this information is entirely within your purview as an officer of the law." I have merely attempted to ensure that the truth reaches you directly from the person most intimately involved in the matter, rather than through speculation or secondary testimony." The inspector rose from his chair and began to pace the room, his mind clearly engaged in the process of reconciling his professional obligations with the extraordinary circumstances of the case. "I shall speak with Mrs. Fletcher," he said finally. "I shall hear her confession directly, and I shall take whatever action is warranted by law and by the evidence she provides. However, I suspect that before this matter is concluded, I shall have a great many more questions for you, Miss Marple." "I would expect nothing less," Miss Marple replied. "The law, unlike human morality, operates according to rather more straightforward principles. I am prepared to assist you in whatever manner proves necessary." Mrs. Constance Fletcher was taken into custody at 8 o'clock that evening, and by 9 o'clock her full confession had been recorded and witnessed by both Inspector Craddock and Sergeant Jenkins. She had maintained her composure throughout the process, with a dignity that impressed even the hardened police officers who had conducted countless interrogations of far less composed individuals. She had provided meticulous details regarding the preparation of the foxglove extract, the timing of its introduction into Lord Pemberton's brandy, and her observations of his behavior toward Cynthia Ashworth that had prompted her to believe that such drastic action was necessary. She had also, with characteristic thoroughness, prepared a written statement explaining her motivations and her understanding of the moral principles that had guided her actions. When asked whether she had any regrets regarding what she had done, Mrs. Fletcher had replied with perfect composure that she regretted only that circumstances had forced her to take such action, but that she would make precisely the same decision if faced with identical circumstances again. The news of Mrs. Fletcher's arrest spread through Thornfield with the speed of wildfire, igniting a firestorm of reaction that ranged from shock to outrage to something approaching sympathy. Village opinion, which had been so prepared to condemn Margaret Ashworth just days earlier, now found itself forced to confront a considerably more morally complex situation. Mrs. Fletcher was not a disreputable outsider or a woman of questionable character. She was instead one of the village's most respected and longest established residents, a woman who had devoted her life to the welfare of others, and whose actions, while technically criminal, had been motivated by what many were beginning to recognize as genuine concern for protecting the vulnerable. The question of how to proceed legally became the subject of considerable deliberation among the authorities. Mrs. Fletcher's confession was unambiguous, and the evidence supporting her guilt was conclusive. Yet the Crown prosecutors found themselves in the awkward position of having to determine whether to bring a capital charge against an elderly woman whose crime, while undeniably serious, had been motivated by what the vast majority of the village's residents were now beginning to view as justice of a higher moral order. The debate that ensued within the legal establishment regarding how such cases should be handled became, in many respects, more significant than the case itself. Miss Marple observed these developments with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had successfully untangled a complex mystery and had directed events toward what she believed to be the most just possible outcome. She was aware that justice, in its legal sense, would likely result in some form of penalty for Mrs. Fletcher. But she was also aware that the version of justice that would ultimately prevail would be considerably more tempered by mercy and understanding than it would have been had an innocent woman been convicted of the crime. Cynthia Ashworth, freed from the predatory attention of Lord Pemberton and armed with a considerably more mature understanding of human nature, began to speak quietly with James Foster about the possibility of a future together. The schoolteacher, who had demonstrated both courage and integrity in his dealings with both Cynthia and her father, appeared to be precisely the sort of steady, dependable man who could provide her with a stable foundation for a life built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Margaret Ashworth, her name cleared of all suspicion, devoted herself with renewed energy to her family and to the welfare of the village's younger women, becoming something of a mentor to those who faced difficulties similar to those Cynthia had encountered. Daniel Ashworth, whose financial irregularities in the parish accounts had been exposed during the investigation, resigned his position as the village's solicitor and removed himself and his family to a small town in the Midlands, where they might begin anew without the weight of recent scandal. While his actions had not been criminal, they had been sufficiently irregular to destroy the trust that had previously been placed in his judgment and his integrity. Miss Marple observed his departure without censure, understanding that shame and the loss of social standing were punishments that many men found far more severe than any legal penalty. Reverend Hartley, after considerable spiritual struggle and consultation with senior clergy, came to view Mrs. Fletcher's actions as a tragic intersection of moral conviction and human frailty. Circumstances in which a well-intentioned woman had been driven by her sense of responsibility to commit an act that, while illegal, had been motivated by genuine concern for the welfare of her community. He visited Mrs. Fletcher in custody and offered her his pastoral support, recognizing that whatever legal penalties she might face, she would be forced to reconcile herself with the taking of a human life. A reconciliation that would, he suspected, occupy the remainder of her years on earth. The trial of Mrs. Constance Fletcher took place 4 months later in the autumn, and it became a media sensation that extended far beyond the small village of Thornfield. Newspapers across the country carried accounts of the case, and lawyers and moral philosophers engaged in vigorous debate regarding the circumstances under which, if ever, the protection of the vulnerable might justify the commission of what would otherwise be considered murder. The jury, after considerable deliberation, returned a verdict of guilty, but they added a strong recommendation for mercy, a formal request that the sentencing judge take into account the extraordinary circumstances of the case and the defendant's motivations in determining appropriate punishment. Mrs. Fletcher received a sentence of 7 years' imprisonment, a punishment that reflected both the seriousness of her crime and the acknowledgement of her motivations. She served her sentence with the same quiet dignity with which she had conducted every other phase of her life, and when she was eventually released, Thornfield welcomed her back as a woman who had made a terrible mistake for what had seemed to her to be the right reasons. Miss Marple, who had followed the trial and its aftermath with careful attention, reflected that justice, in its truest sense, was rarely as simple as the law would have it appear, and that mercy and compassion were sometimes as necessary to the maintenance of a just society as punishment and consequence.